Greetings, everyone. Happy Friday. This is Jackie Lukman, and you are uh, uh, viewing another episode of the People's Power Hour here in Lukman Nation. If you're watching on Black Power Media, you are watching on the most dangerous platform on social media here in Lukman Nation, the most dangerous show on social media. It's been a day, y'all. It's been a week. It's been really, really busy as it always is. But we are here. So glad to see you all with us for another week. Please excuse the background noise. One of my neighbors has decided that now is a good time to weed or whatever it is that they're doing in their backyard. So there's a little bit of background noise, but I am glad that you are here because y'all know I have wanted to have this conversation for a long time about spirituality and the movement, its place in the struggle for liberation, liberation theology, and its place in the revolution, and a bunch of other things. But I didn't want to have the conversation myself. Just me sitting here talking about what I think about things, because I'm no expert. And I don't know that to any degree anybody can be an expert on spirituality because it's a very personal thing, right? But I think there are some historical and material truths about organizing Black people, organizing working class and poor Black people. And one of those truths is you're not going to organize a lot of working class and poor Black people if you got a problem with faith and spirituality, because that's a big thing for a lot of us. And if we are talking about being internationalists, guess what? A lot of people around the world are also people of faith, even revolutionary people. So let's get into this. Let's get into this discussion. And I want to see what our guest has to say because I'm so excited that he is here to help us dig into this. I want to introduce to everyone Dr. Makungu Akinyela, a founding member of the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement and the new African Peoples Organization. He is an elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He is a professor of Africana Studies in the Africana Studies Department at Georgia State University, and he is a licensed therapist. Dr. Akinyela, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, Sister Jackie, thank you so much for this invitation. I'm happy to be here. Always happy to talk about liberation and freedom with anybody that's willing to engage the conversation.
I'm so glad to hear that because, Doctor, I have been carrying around this frustration for years. And this frustration is the tension between revolutionaries who are deeply and vehemently opposed to spirituality of any kind. And look, let me say at the outset, I'm not here to judge anybody's spiritual beliefs or reality. I say that all the time. I'm not in the business of proselytizing people. Where your soul goes, if you believe your soul goes somewhere else in the afterlife, that is way above my pay grade. And my position is we all gonna find out who was right one day. And at that point, it's not gonna matter, right? So I don't entertain the ideas of proselytizing people and getting them to accept one, ideology or belief or the other. But what I do notice, what I do realize is that as a Christian, as a person of faith who is also a revolutionary and an organizer, I see the revolutionary example of Jesus Christ in the scriptures.
Mm-hmm.
But I understand that because of people's position on, particularly revolutionary, a lot of Pan-Africanist, African Black organizers, they see Christianity as a white man's religion. They see it as a tool of oppression, particularly in this country, of our people, and certainly the the colonization through missionary work is absolutely, internationally is absolutely a black eye on the faith. So there's all of this, and that creates, I think, this tension between revolutionaries who want the liberation of our people, but they don't want to have anything to do with people of our they don't want to have anything to do with our people of faith, who also want the same thing, right? Who are also in struggle, in organizing, fighting for liberation of our people, and connecting that work to our faith. How do, first I should say, do you see this tension? And has it gotten worse? Has it gotten better? How do you see this situation?
Well, I think probably I have lived this tension for most of my political career. In that, I'm a child of the '60s. I grew up in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and my parents were civil rights organizers with Medgar Evers. And so I always saw the progressive liberating part of the church, going to civil rights meetings in Mississippi with folks, seeing folks, when I was 8 years old, my mother will tell the story. I went to jail in Mississippi, starting with a march with SNCC members, some kids who took me along, right? Things like that. So I was always involved and saw, in that sense, the church as a progressive, liberating thing, and always, being a member of the African Methodist Church, always being kind of centered in that Black African identity. That was the reality of my growing up. My family moved to California, and I'm a child of the '60s and '70s. And like a lot of young brothers and sisters, I became alienated from the church from that period as I joined the movement. And for most of my teenage years, going into my adulthood, until I was in my 30s, I was alienated from the church. And I was drawn back into the church because at that time there was a very progressive church that was, for some reason, was drawing all the political activists in Los Angeles, was feeding the hungry, was dealing with police abuse, was doing all these things, led by a pastor named Frank Reed. Everybody was joining that church. And so our organization sent me in to organize and see what was going on with that church. And through doing that, I was drawn back into my faith, through that. And in that happening, all the political folks, my comrades, expected, oh, you're gonna leave us now. You're a Christian now. You're gonna leave us. But again, I was in a context where, for me, okay, I'm even more determined about this struggle because of this faith that I'm reacquainting myself with, right? And again, like a lot of young comrades in that period, we had the Nation of Islam around us. There were brothers and sisters who, the Black Panther Party was there. We were a part of that. Our formation name at that time went through several things, the African Peoples Party, other things. And so people who were dialectical materialists, the whole thing. And so, people who said we didn't need any of that. It was, some people were beginning to relate to indigenous African religions, particularly Ifa, things of that nature, right? But everybody expected, particularly since I said, I declared that I'm a part of this church community now, that within a few months, clearly was not going to be a part of the movement, right? And so that tension even then begins to come. And so, and even within our movement, there were people who were hardline dialectical materialists who accepted what I would call a Eurocentric Marxist idea of what materialism means. and accepted this idea that any ideas of God didn't make any sense, right? And so there was always that tension. Now, you asked about more recently, as I've watched, particularly over, say, the last 20 years or so, as our movement has kind of gone through the ebbs and flows, I have seen more young people who express their connection to the church, to faith, to a religious faith. Particularly, in this case, we're talking about Christianity, right? And obviously, more and more young people who really latch on to traditional African religion, Ifa, right? And who are doing that as a part of giving them emotional, spiritual support in the middle of their struggle. And I think that's a good thing, right? And I think what that has done is it's opened up the conversation. Of course, the thing that creates the most tension for people these days is still for people who declare themselves Christian. Right. And so how do you as a Christian fit yourself into a full-fledged liberation struggle? And that's the tension these days. But as I said, the tension has always been there, during this period, from the 60s on. So absolutely.
So I wanna address something that I hear a lot from
Mhm.
people, some people I organize with, because I really am fascinated about what this answer could be from you. I hear all the time, how are you going to get free when you believe in the white man's God, right? The idea that Christianity is a religion that white people made up to use to oppress us and other people, the indigenous, obviously, the doctrine of discovery, Monroe Doctrine, all of these horrible genocidal policies, the Indian Removal Acts and Manifest Destiny, all of these horrible policies that have been in this, and that's just limited to this country, that have been used to oppress, if not commit a near genocide against people, but all based on this idea that the white representation of God and Jesus is supreme, and everyone else who doesn't believe that is a savage, and needs to either be converted or exterminated, right? So now I understand that is the white supremacist interpretation of the scriptures. But what of the idea that Christianity itself is a white man's religion?
Well, it's become more and more clear for me. Now, I'm not arguing this for anybody else, but what these so-called evangelicals call Christianity has nothing to do with my religion. It has nothing to do with the creator that I know, the God that I know, and they've made it more and more clear. And did we receive a European interpretation of the scriptures when we came here? Yes, but also it's also true that that not all of the Africans who were brought here as enslaved people came here practicing indigenous religions. Probably 12 or to 15% were Muslim, right? Another smaller percentage actually were Christian, right? And have been practicing Christianity from those areas that they were. And in fact, one of the things that we know, and this is where research and history becomes important, right? That, the Christian church existed down in as far as the Congo up until the 13th century, when Islam came and began to eradicate many of the churches and transform those churches into mosques, right? The strand of Christianity that we now call Coptic in Egypt, that we call Orthodox in Ethiopia, right? Which were some of the first organized churches in the days of the Roman Empire. So, Christians began to organize themselves and develop in Africa, 2,000 years ago or more, established, as again, the so-called Coptic tradition in Kemet, in Egypt, establishing the Orthodox tradition in Ethiopia, and those traditions went as far down the Nile as going towards the Congo, right? Again, those only began to be eradicated with the incursion in many places of Islam, right? And the other part of this is, the truth of it is, any religion can be used for oppression. I remind people of Papa Doc Duvalier, right? And Haiti, right? Vodun is an honorable religious tradition of our people. Papa Doc distorted it under the wing of Western imperialism and colonialism, and turned it into a destructive and horrible thing, right? In India, Hindu fascism is rising up, right? And again, so any religion in itself can be used destructively, right? But going back to that original question, I don't accept this idea that Christianity is something that just bloomed full blown out of the mind of a white supremacist. White supremacists have done what colonizers and imperialists have done forever. They grab a thing, take it as their own, and remix it, and then introduce it to the people that they're trying to oppress. The thing that I think people who make this argument continue to try to ignore is that all along the way, even when our people dealt with the introduced Christianity of Europeans, they took it and Africanized it, right? You can't talk about Christianity without talking about Nat Turner, Denmark VC, Sojourner Truth. You can't take it without talking about those Africans who used the very scriptural text that the oppressors used and turned it into a revolutionary text, right? Which is the bottom line reason, for instance, why literacy and reading was outlawed for Africans in North America, because of the fear that they would read the scriptures. It's why Thomas Jefferson, they created a whole Bible called the Slave Bible, where they annotated and took out and only left those parts that could be twisted and used to enslave people. All right. That shows a resistance, a fight and a resistance, not just people who sat and passively accepted something. Right. And it also shows we have tons of records of white missionaries who were really concerned about leaving Africans to read the Bible by themselves because of how they interpreted the Bible, how they understood the Bible. Right. And so I've come to accept it's okay if you are troubled by my religion because you believe that you are a revolutionary. I personally can put my revolutionary credentials up against anybody that I believe I come up against, right? And again, if we're going to do it in an African way, right? Oftentimes these people are trying to force us into a revolutionary orthodoxy, which is the same thing that the oppressors do. Right? They have the idea of right thought. If you don't think like me, then you can't be with me, right? Whereas Africans traditionally have focused not on orthodoxy, but on orthopraxis. Not how you think, but how you act, right?
Say that. I'm sorry. Say that word again.
Orthopraxis, right?
Wow.
This Eurocentric imperialist way is orthodoxy. If you don't think exactly the way I think, if you are not doing it the orthodox way, if you're not interpreting the scriptures the way I interpret the scriptures, right? Where again is that the Jesus of the scriptures says that it's about spirit and truth, not the letter of the law, right? Right. It's the spirit that is most important. And so, but oftentimes, and I think this is just the reality. We are all victims of colonialism.
Right.
We all have had our minds colonized. And so just like our faith was colonized, sometimes our politics are colonized. And we think that we are acting out in revolutionary Black ways. And we're in fact reproducing the same oppressive, dominant forms of so-called revolution that the colonizers have done, right? Where In other words, we're gonna kill everybody who doesn't agree with us. We're gonna negate anybody who doesn't agree exactly with us and fall into line behind us. Whereas I'm looking for a revolutionary environment and a revolutionary situation which is truly democratic, which allows the blooming of the human spirit, right? Which allows, when I talk about the so-called kingdom of God, I prefer the idea of the kingdom of God. It's not about a top-down dominant idea of a so-called kingdom, which again is a European interpretation. It's that interpretation of God's creation in heaven that's basically a replica of the Roman Empire, right? And so that's coming out of their experience, right? There are other experiences of what the dominion of God looks like: a kinship, a connection, a connectiveness, right? Which is grounded in what? Justice, right? And not the justice of the legal courts, right? And we call that, retributive justice, right? In other words, if you don't act right, God gonna punish you. That's how
Right.
That's how many of these Christians, both black and white, think about God's justice, as opposed to God's justice being distributive justice. In other words, enough for everybody. The kind of God's justice that's caught up in the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 with 2 loaves of bread and 7 fishes, right? Everybody got enough. Don't worry about it. Everybody's going to get fed, right? That's socialism.
I was about to say, are you trying to say Jesus is a socialist?
Jesus was about justice, preached justice, and justice is about distribution, right? It's the same justice that's grounded in the stories, even from the Hebrew scriptures, of the Day of Jubilee, where everybody gets to have back what they lost, over the time. If you've had to give up something because you were in poverty, you're guaranteed to give it back. The speech that Jesus introduces his ministry into the world with, from Luke: the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the prisoners go free. And it's, in other words, the whole point of a revolution is to bring justice to the poor, to the prison, to the imprisoned, to the hungry. The whole point of Jesus's ministry is to do the same thing. And so for me, in declaring faith, it works perfectly in line with my revolutionary ideals, my socialist ideals, my liberation ideals. And I don't believe it's me twisting or mixing the words of the scripture, but reading them and understanding them, right? And so I ask people, okay, I absolutely get our problems with colonized Christianity. I absolutely get it, and I absolutely agree with it. I absolutely get and agree with our problems with white supremacy that's embedded in so-called evangelicalism. When we actually talk about, though, what is the good news? What does the kingdom of God look like? What is the kingdom of heaven like? What's expected of participants in that movement according to the scriptures, right? Not according to even Paul, but according to, the words that we have, that we say are the words of Jesus. What would a society like that look like? And are we opposed to that? That becomes the question to ask, right? And that doesn't mean that you have to agree or become a part of that movement. But why would you be opposed to something like that actually supports and moves forward the vision of a society that you say you have?
Because here's the thing. I love that you said that your belief comes out of reading the Bible. Here's the thing. When I sat in church for most of my life and just listened to the pastor say things and did not actually read the book, I believed a lot of the foolishness that they said about the very that the faith is mostly about controlling people. It's about
Mm-hmm.
obedience and control, particularly of women's bodies. That's what
Mm-hmm.
you hear a lot of
Mm-hmm.
from the pulpit. And I don't care who's in the pulpit, whether it's a white pastor or a black pastor,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's a male pastor or a woman pastor,
Mm-hmm.
if they're operating in the traditional Christian interpretation, they're
Mm-hmm.
preaching a theology of obedience to authority, of not making waves, of
Mm-hmm.
praying for the oppressors in the face of injustice, and not expecting justice in this life, but
Mm-hmm.
waiting for it until you die and then you get your mansion in heaven, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you're just supposed to pray and tithe, and if you're a woman, keep your legs closed, and you know find a nice man, Christian man to marry, have all his babies, keep the house, and not a whole lot of instruction for the men except to be godly, upstanding men, and that's a catch-all for anything that really doesn't catch
Mm-hmm.
anything. Um, so when we when I can't remember what it was that I asked about in Bible study one day that I didn't agree with, and the
Mm-hmm.
pastor got so angry with me, and I just thought, that's really uncharacteristic. That just doesn't make sense. I'm just asking a question because
Mm-hmm.
I don't see that. Oh, it was a scripture on homosexuality,
Mm-hmm.
and I said, I'm sorry, I don't see how God is this angry at human beings that he created to be this way. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't make sense to me. I don't buy that this is true. And the response from him was just so vitriolic. And I said, wait a minute. Let me read what he is. Let me really read these scriptures that he's referencing.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I read them, I realized, oh wait, I think he's taking this out of context
Mm-hmm.
entirely. I don't think he's talking about same gender sex. I think he's talking, and you do a little bit of research
Mm-hmm.
into what those scriptures are referencing, and then you realize they're really not talking about same gender relationships. They're talking about something else entirely. They're
Mm-hmm.
talking about rape of children in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
And so then that caused me to wonder, what else have these people been lying to me about what's in this book? So that caused me to actually read the Bible
Mm-hmm.
and to do the research about the historical culture of the time and what some of these things meant and how we got the Bible and all of that kind of stuff. So when we understand that there are things that are in the Bible that people have never wanted us to know were there. I mean, and that to me makes those things very, very important in this struggle for liberation. What are a couple of those things, and how are they connected to liberation theology? And of course, I'm just to give you a hint, if I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, but I'm thinking about a particular trek of a people out of
Mm-hmm.
400 years of a situation.
Absolutely. Well, that's one of the things that was taken out of the slave Bible, for instance.
Hmm.
There's no
Hmm.
references, and one of the things that I have come to understand in my reading of the scriptures is that however those scriptures were brought together from the beginning in Genesis through the end, there's an ongoing theme that the biblical texts, no matter where the stories are against empire.
Mm. Mm.
That- from the beginning, starting with the myth of the Tower of Babel, right? It begins with an opposition to the Babylonian Empire, right? Breaking down the Tower of Babel. It's against empire. There's certain characteristics of empire, right? Empire is always dominating, oppressive, excluding, marginalizing. Empire is always exploitative. right? And always takes from the least of these, the poorest. And oftentimes, particularly in the Hebrew scriptures, what was the so-called Old Testament, the poorest and the least of these were described as the widows and the orphans and the foreigner, right? Because these are people who have no land connections to give them power. Widows, because women without a husband had no connection to ownership of land. Orphans, because they had no parents who owned land. Foreigners, because they were travelers in the land and were not connected to the land, so therefore had no rights. And so anytime the scriptures talked about justice and who you should be taking care of, it was the widows, the orphans, and the foreigners, the travelers, the pilgrims. And so all throughout, and then that big story that you bring up is about the dominant empire of that time, Egypt, right? And it's about a social movement. It's about a social movement against empire, right? An empire that is doing what? Doing everything it can to exploit its workers, right? When the workers begin to say, we just want a little time to go and just kind of practice being ourselves, practice our understanding and relationship to the divine, to God. What does the empire say? Oh, well, no, we ain't gonna let y'all do that. As a matter of fact, we're gonna make your work harder. You think it was hard enough making them bricks and building those buildings? We're gonna take away the straw that you use to hold the bricks together, and you still gotta produce bricks, right? It sounds something like that, that's what CEOs do, right? Right. And so they're exploiting their workers, they're making life hard. They're committing genocide because they become afraid of populations, and so what do? They kill the boy children. So they're creating genocide, and so what does the reaction happens is that the people rise up. The people rise up and begin to strive for self-determination. Right? They strive for self-determination, as they begin to exit themselves away from the oppressor colonizing nation. Right. One of the things that's always interesting that we miss, it's that so-called as the Israelites leave Egypt, or Kemet for my Afrocentric brothers and sisters, as they leave, they say there's a mixed multitude. In other words, it ain't just them. It's Egyptians too. It's a whole bunch of people leaving. Right. It's a mixed multitude. And then it says that they leave, and the Egyptians pay them reparations.
Oh, wait, say what now?
The Egyptians are giving them gold and silver on their exit as reparations for what, so they can go on their journey, right? But again, it's a struggle against the empire. What if the slave Bible had left that story in there? The other important thing about that is, and I think because people don't understand history, right? We often go with fairy tales. The reality is that our people were enslaved from 1619 on this portion of the continent. And for almost 250 years, new blood was being brought into this slave population. New brothers and sisters from Africa. So the African culture and African tradition was replenished and replenished and replenished for almost 250 years. And the truth is, it's a myth that white people were focusing on trying to make these Africans Christians. They didn't care about their religion. They just wanted them to work. And so white people were not paying attention. And in fact, most white people were not significantly Christian in the early days of the founding of this country. Why?
What?
Because the primary religion of Anglos in that particular was either Catholicism or Anglicanism, the Church of England.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So,
which are very similar religions, which are both heavily grounded in what? Literacy. In other words, in order to be baptized, to be fully a part of the church, you have to read, memorize, and be able to recite the catechism. Okay. When you are able to recite the catechism, which basically says what you actually believe, then you are given communion, you are baptized. Most of these white folks couldn't read. All right. And so and they were too busy trying to farm land and whatever to be thinking about all that mess, Catholicism or the Church of England or whatever it was. So they weren't interested in their own religion, none less interested in their enslaved people being religious. They just wanted them to work. And in many of the areas, particularly the Black Belt, what we call New Africa, the Deep South, in many of these areas, Africans were becoming the majority population, and white folks were just coming to just check on them every now and then, which meant that for at least a couple of 100 years to 250 years, Africans were able to maintain their own cultural identities, traditions, and ways of being. And for most of that time, they were not Christian. That's important for us to understand. It's not like, there was some kind of a Christianizing factory going on where as soon as you got off the boat, they made you declare your loyalty to Jesus, right? So African culture was formed and cooked over decades and a couple of centuries. Africans did not significantly begin converting to Christianity in this country until what's called the Great Revivals, which was a religious movement that began in England and around in the mid 1700s, right? About 1780, 1790. And people like John Wesley, right? These Baptist preachers, Methodist preachers from England came over here and began preaching, in revivals. These revivals people would come and they'd last sometimes for weeks. The significant difference between these Methodists and Baptists as compared to the Catholics and the Anglicans is that they were preaching, and they had vibrant, emotional preaching, which is grounded in what? Rather than literacy, is grounded in orality. Orality is the basis of most West African cultures, much more than literacy, except for those brothers and sisters who were Muslim. Orality, storytelling, hearing the word or audibly is a deep part of our culture. And for the first time, many of these enslavers would allow their enslaved people to participate in these revivals, so they became like festivals. There, they heard these stories about the Hebrew children. They heard these stories about Israel getting free from Pharaoh. They heard these stories about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace where the evil emperor tried to burn them up for not bowing down to the emperor's God. They heard about Daniel in the lion's den, right? Where Daniel refused to bow down and pray to the emperor but yet was protected in the lion's den. And so consequently, we began to hear what W.E.B. Du Bois calls those sorrow songs. We call them spirituals. And if you listen to the spirituals, most of them don't focus on Jesus directly. They focus on those stories of Israel struggling against the empire, right? They focus on the Hebrews struggling either against the Egyptian empire or the Babylonian empire or some empire, right? So these stories, James Cone wrote a great book called The Spirituals and the Blues, right? And which he says, this is where we can understand an Africanized theology of Christianity through the spirituals and the blues that our people have sung. It talks about our understanding of God's nature. Right? And so when we begin to understand that significant numbers of Africans didn't even start to convert to Christianity until 1790, that changes how we think about this thing, right? That means that and then the last great revival was in 1840. And so Africans did not become predominantly Christian in North America until about 1840. That means for just less than 200 years have we been significantly Christian.
Wow.
That's right. And the other important thing that's important is that we became Christian when we decided to become Christian, not because we were made Christian. That's important. One of the important,
Wow. That is a history that I've no, I'm sorry. Go ahead. You
no,
froze up for a second there.
the colonizing idea, the colonizing story that we receive about ourselves is that we are perpetual victims, but we don't talk about the fight back. We don't talk about the resistance that has
Mm,
shaped who we are. And so even so-called progressive people focus on the doom and gloom and the old po black folks. And also in that story is this idea that somehow we are empty, blank-minded vessels, as opposed to this idea our people chose when they would deal with this Christian God based upon them seeing some worth in this Christian God, a God that'll fight to end slavery, a God that will fight with the oppressed against the oppressor. And so what they saw in this religion was a religion that's against empire. Even when you get to the so-called New Testament, ultimately the story of Jesus bringing the good news of the kingdom of heaven is about an anti-imperialist movement. What's the empire? It's Rome. Every one of those stories, familiar stories. Jesus, the story of the Gadarene demoniac. You're a church girl, so you probably remember that story. Jesus is going, and
mhm,
they see this wild man. He's breaking chains. He's cutting himself up. He's obviously
mhm.
he's possessed by demons, as the story gets told. And Jesus says, "What is your name?" And he says, "Our name is Legion."
Our name is Legion, for we are many.
The
Mhm,
important thing there is in that area of Palestine, it was controlled by a Roman legion. A legion is a group of at least 1,000 soldiers. And it just so happened is that the symbol of that legion in that area was a wild boar, a pig. They were called the pigs. Okay, that's an important thing to understand. And so we
What?
know in that story what happens, don't we? Jesus, he says, don't cast me out. Well, if you cast me out, put me where? In those pigs over there, right?
Mhm.
My name is Legion, for we are many. And the word that's used for legion, the Greek word is polis. The Greek, the Roman population. In other words, this man is symbolic of an area that's infested by colonial occupation. Okay.
Wow.
And it's a military occupying force. It's a story about that, right? And the madness, what does colonialism do to the people it occupies? It drives them crazy. It makes them do self-harm, right? It makes them fight against the people that they love. That's what colonialism does. Right. And this is so every story that we see, we can see the relationship, the impact of the Roman Empire on people. What else does occupation do? When the Roman Empire occupied Palestine, every business, all the food was taken up. That's why there's so many poor people, starving people, sick people, because all the food in the Sea of Galilee, all the fish that were caught were used to feed the Roman occupation army or sent back to Rome, right? People were landless except for the collaborators, the Sadducees in the story. That's why they were hated. Who were the tax collectors? They collected taxes for the Roman Empire. That's why they were hated, right? So the entire story of Jesus' interaction and building a movement is about building an anti-colonial movement, whether we like to talk about that part or not, right? And it's about building up a resistance by saying, what? I'm not a subject of Rome or a citizen of the Roman Empire. I'm a child of God living in the kingdom of heaven. I'm not loyal to Caesar. I'm loyal to God, right? And that becomes a treasonous act, which is the reason that Jesus then is what? Executed. And he's executed in the way that revolutionaries were executed. Crucifixion was an execution reserved for revolutionaries to scare people who might try to follow them. In the same way that Africans were hung on lynching trees to scare the other Africans, had their heads cut off and stuck on signposts so that the other Africans could see what they were doing. And so we see it because why? Because this is the way of colonialism and empire. And so it was true then. It's true for us Africans, for our African ancestors. It's true today. Empire has a characteristic. And that characteristic, I believe, is highlighted throughout the scriptures. And all the scriptures are about a resistance to empire, up to and including the end of the book, which, at the center of that book, of course, is who? The so-called Antichrist, the one who is against Christ, right? That's about a character. It's about a way of being in the world, which is anti-God. It's focused on selfishness, lying, criminality, as opposed to the way of the Jesus movement, which was about what? Metanoia, relationship, building relationship, right? Yeah. So that was long, but I'm sorry.
No, don't apologize, because I just learned what that allegory about the possessed man meant. I never made that connection, that the possessed man represents the actual Roman legion. Do you know how many horror movies have been based on this idea that Satan called himself Legion and that he possesses people? And that's what, oh my gosh. And we're talking about the literal Roman
It's
legion.
occupation, it's possession. And that's what colonialism does. Colonialism is demonic in itself. Imperialism is demonic in itself. And see, Europeans who are creating an empire, who read the scriptures from the top down. So they read as if they're in charge. But what if you read the scriptures from the bottom up, as if you're the people that's there, right? If you read it as if you're that woman who has been suffering a hemorrhage of blood for most of her life. If you read it as that, if you read it as if you are those hungry people, right, who are hungry and needing food, and Jesus has this answer, right? And if you begin to read it, and you'll also see the kingdom of God is right here, right now, if you have the eyes to see and the ears to hear. So in other words, Jesus never says, you got to wait to die to go to heaven.
Oh, say it.
Right? That is never it. Jesus always says the kingdom of God is right here. But you just got to have, in other words, you got, if you are in this period of time, if you are caught up in your exploitation and your oppression, you say you're a drug addict, all you have are what Paulo Freire called our limit situations. All you see is, look, all I can do today is get up and get another hit. That's all I see. But what happens when a brother or sister transforms themselves? What happened to Malcolm as he's sitting in that jail, right? And he, for whatever reason, begins to read and think about himself as something other than a criminal. When he thought of himself as a criminal, he acted like a criminal. But when his eyes were open, he saw a different world, and he saw a different way to relate to people. That's the kingdom of God, right? The kingdom of heaven is already here. But when you're caught up in your limit situations, right? If you think that you're oppressed, you just act oppressed. But what happens when you no longer believe that you are oppressed, even though you may be in an oppressive situation? One of the most powerful, the movie years ago, back in the 80s, Denzel did a movie on, God, what was it called? Cry Freedom. Where he played Steve Biko, right? And there's an amazing scene in that movie, Cry Freedom, which I think illustrates this idea of what the Jesus movement was trying to instill in people under the thumb of the Roman Empire. Steve Biko goes to the home of his white friend, the reporter who actually wrote the book, Cry Freedom. And he knocks on his door. The white man comes to the door and opens it, and he says, "What are you doing? It's after curfew." And Biko says, this is my country. I'm a free man. I go where I want. In other words, he refused to act like a colonized person, even though his physical reality was colonialism. He walked like a free man. In other words, he saw something different and heard something different in the world than other people tried to impose on him. And the question is, what if a whole nation of people began to do that under the thumb of colonialism? That was the scary thing of the Jesus movement at that time, why Jesus was executed, because creating that kind of a movement becomes a frightening thing. What happens when you have a movement in America where Black people refuse to any longer see themselves as colonized, as second, as less than, and refuse to be governable, right? And begin to act like they're free, even though the situation might not show that. It creates what Dr. King them used to call attention. It creates tension.
Mm-hmm.
That's revolutionary action, right? Creating tension between the oppressed and the oppressor, as opposed to when the oppressed act oppressed, there's no tension. Things just go on as they are.
Mm-hmm.
But when the oppressed begin to transform themselves and act as if they are not oppressed, even though they may be in an oppressive situation, it creates tension and it gets in action. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that leads us to, we have to then make other decisions when that happens. But that's an important part of the movement. That's what I see when I read the scriptures, from the bottom up.
Yeah, I so appreciate this, and so many people in the chat are appreciative of it too. I like to make sure I get to some people's questions as we're going along. So this was a question that was asked earlier, and you answered it a little bit, but I wondered if you wanted to say more about it. But how does Christianity make space for our traditional African mythos?
Absolutely.
Yeah. How does it?
A lot of my friends, there's mixed reviews on the Apostle Paul.
Yeah, I have opinions.
I like Paul, right? Because I think people misread Paul. First of all, too many of those books in the Bible are attributed to Paul, and they're actually by fake Pauls that were done years later when the church had become more conservative. But the 7 books that we know are definitely Paul. When we read them, they are radical books in that line of being anti-imperial, right? In the same way. All those books that we attribute to Paul, I know so-called evangelicals or conservative Christians are troubled by that, but that's the truth. They read totally different, right? Right? They read totally different. Like those books of Timothy and all those books that's talking about, all that kind of conservative. It's at a time when the church had been established, the Gentile church. In other words, no longer the Palestinian oppressed colonized church, but the church that the white folks had taken over. It's kind of like, you come from Kojic, right? Now, we're holiness folk, right? You know about the Azusa Street revival.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Black folks had revival over in LA, my hometown, for months and months and months, to the point that white people started coming to the church and started getting sanctified and saved and filled with the Holy Ghost at Azusa Street. And whereas Azusa Street is the beginning of the Black Holiness Church, the Kojic Church and all that, white folks went back and created what's the White Holiness Church called?
I do not know.
But the reason they did it is they didn't want to say that they were beholden to a Black man laying hands on them.
Wow.
That's the sanctification. They started speaking tongues at Azusa Street, right? Right.
So they accepted the sanctification and the gift of tongues,
and then they
but they didn't
to
want to tell nobody it came through a Black
they
man.
went back to that Southern way of being in that Southern Apostolic Church, that white Apostolic Church now that's a part of Trump land, right? The so-called evangelical movement.
And
but
he ain't even one of them. But
that's the same understanding we have to have of what happened in the early days of the Jesus movement. There's a Palestinian movement, followers of the Jesus movement, that's absolutely anti-imperialist. And in the same way, people are looking for something as Gentiles began to take up these ideas over the years. They're Roman citizens. They're part of the empire, right? And so the writings that we get under the name of Paul, which is sometimes 50, 60, 100 years after Paul, are much more conservative, right? Slaves, obey your masters. These kinds of things, right? That's what we're seeing. But that's not what I don't believe that that's authentic Paul. So going back to that point, Paul has this idea. First of all, Paul's evangelizing, his sharing of the good news was never to dominate. For instance, there's a story of Paul on Mars Hill. I was just in Greece this past summer, and I was able to see Mars Hill, right? This is a place where Greek philosophers would go and debate and stuff like that. And Paul's way was, he says, I see y'all are very religious. You have a lot of really wonderful statues here to various gods. And I see you have here one that says to the unknown God. Well, let me talk to you about that God that I think that is. Let me tell you about that God. And Paul begins to talk about his understanding of the divine. He never says, oh, y'all, that's crazy what y'all doing. You shouldn't be doing that. He says, let me show you what I got. Let me show you how what you think relates to what I think. That for me, that becomes a model for one thing, right? But the other part of it is that what becomes clear also is that religion should not be about culture. And that's what the colonists have done. That's what Europeans have done. They have mixed their culture with religion. In other words, people used to come up to me and say, remember I told you that I've been in that tension for years. They say, now that you're a Christian, you're gonna start using your Christian name. Right? What they want to know is, am I going right? That African name is not a Christian name, right? In other words, you're gonna be Peter now, or Jack, or Richard. Yeah, because they're mixing up European culture with the faith, first of all. And Christians aren't the only ones to do it. People think that just because you become Muslim, you got to take an Arab name, right? Right? Things like that. But this mixing of culture. But what's one thing that I believe is clear, again, from in the Pauline tradition, the radical Pauline tradition, not that colonized one, is that, each of us should be able to come into God, into the kingdom of God, grounded in our own culture. Paul fought hard that Gentiles should not have to convert to Judaism to understand God, right? Gentiles should not have to get circumcised or eat kosher, right? Or they should not have to do these things, because that's not, God is the God of the entire universe, right? In that same way, that they should be able to draw from their own traditions and see that tradition in the light of the Mashiach, the Messiah. Okay. What I believe that, God speaks to all people, that God has spoken to our people since the foundation. And for me, I say that for me, as a follower of the Mashiach, the Messiah, Jesus, our African traditions are our version of what some people call the Old Testament. God spoke to us through the Orisha, right? God spoke to us through that African tradition. I still give honor to my ancestors, because that's an important part of, right? I pour libation to my ancestors. I recognize my ancestors. If you look over here, you'll see my ancestral altar right here, right? I believe that God was speaking to our ancestors then, right? What that means is that we have to fight against colonial misinterpretation of our culture, because that's a part of white supremacy, right? To call anything that Africans do devil worship or whatever, when we didn't even have a concept of a devil. I
Oh,
don't
wow.
believe that, you know, and I believe even the whole, this is a whole nother show maybe, but there's a whole book on, basically, the devil is definitely a created thing, right?
Yeah, that's another show. Because see, people in the chat are already saying this should be a regular segment. So
But I mean, for instance, absolutely, in the mystical tradition of Jesus, right? The mystical Hebrew tradition, there's an idea of, the shaitan, right? And the idea is that in all of us, when we are born, when we are created, there's a movement towards good and a movement towards evil. That's in all of us.
mhm.
And it's always there, right? Um, St. James says in the book of James, it says, don't blame what you're doing on the devil.
Don't he say it though? He absolutely says that in the book.
Yeah, yeah, that's
You're
you.
like, no, this you.
That's you, right? But that's what we do, is we want to put it outside of us. But that's that evil inclination. That's the spiritual struggle that we have, moving constantly towards the good. Paul talks about, he says, the struggle between flesh and spirit, the fleshly person and the spiritual person. The fleshly person is focused on what? Or the soulish person. That's the real interpretation. The soulish person is focused on what? Selfish needs. My food, my clothes, my house. The spiritual person is focused on the koinonia, the community, right? The person who's focused on spirit is concerned about the community. Whereas the person who's focused on flesh or soul is focused only in their own individual rights. What does that sound like? Colonialism, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
definitely.
Whereas
Definitely Americanism,
right.
for sure.
Whereas the person who's focused on spirit, it's not about being focused on being spooky in the sky. It's about the koinonia. It's the community. It's about not focusing on this is mine. No, you know what? I'm going to figure a way that we can share this, so that if one person doesn't have something, we all have. That's a spiritual connection, right? Because again, John says, how can you say you love God who you have never seen, and you hate your brother and
Hate
sister
your
who you
brother.
see every day?
See
So
every
the
day.
only way that we can express real love for God is how we treat our comrades, our brothers and sisters, right? That's the call. And so for me, when I look at my ancestors' traditions, their religions, I can be informed by that. I see it again through the eyes of the Messiah, right? Through the gospel. But I see this is God talking to our ancestors then, right? For me, and this is my personal call, right? This is not, I don't say it for everybody. When God was speaking to our ancestors then, colonialism was not a problem. But for me, what the gospel does is it gives me a way of thinking about and fighting colonialism and imperialism. And I believe that God has always been a God against empire. And gospel gives me a way of understanding how me and God and my community are able to struggle against the empire, right? But that doesn't mean that I got to throw my ancestors' ways into the bucket. Just like you can read the Old Testament from Genesis to the prophets, right? And they inform, but you don't stay in them. The gospel becomes our guidance, but the Old Testament informs us. I'm also informed by the Old Agreement, the Old Testament of my ancestors, my African traditions. And I don't have to back away from them or be ashamed of them or be afraid of them, nor declare them somehow evil or satanic. That's a European concept, right? Which has nothing to do with my folk.
That's this is badly needed, I think, for me personally, as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus Christ. And I always tell people, That and well, let me address the Paul thing, because when I read the Pauline doctrine, I of course get stuck on the books that are focused on obedience and authority, right? And I looked at that as, and I think this gets to Geechee Motivator's question. How you doing, Geechee? Good to see you. How do you see the difference of Paul's gospel from Christ versus the 11+1 gospel from Christ in the context of liberation theology? I think you just answered that question, but it's hard to read the Pauline Gospels without getting stuck on the authoritarian parts, because that is, of course, where the evangelical movement gets a lot of their doctrine from. The obey authority no matter what. It's where they get this from. So how do we deal with the evangelical Christian, the white evangelical Christian movement in this country politically? And do you see revolutionary Christians who are rooted in liberation theology doing and saying enough to combat or even be vocal against what these people have done to the faith?
I think this is going to be a multi-level answer.
We like those here.
This is not the time to try to have conversations with so-called evangelicals. They are part of the colonizer. They are, right now we're at a war, right? And we just have to accept that, right? It's not time to try to convince somebody. I believe that we should try to live to the highest of our Christian ethics and ways of being. In my church, I've been leading a study on the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew, and we talked about what is the character of a citizen of the king of the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. What does that character look like? And it's tight. It pushes us because it requires some real spiritual discipline, right? It challenges me, but I believe that's about how we deal with the brothers and sisters who are a part of what Dr. King used to call the beloved community. Right now, so-called evangelicals have placed themselves in the religion of empire. It's like the days of the Jesus movement. The religion of the Roman Empire was based upon warfare, victory, and celebration, right? It was totally antithetical to this movement that was growing in Palestine of people following Jesus as the Messiah, proclaiming the kingdom of heaven. There was a Roman religion. Now, the Roman religion says you can be a part of Rome and you can practice that little religion you want to, but you have to give obedience to Caesar as Lord, Caesar as the Son of God. This was the contradiction between Jesus' people, because they could never declare that Caesar was Lord.
Right.
They could never declare that Caesar was the Son of God. And the Romans would say, look, just burn some incense to Caesar and you can go to have all the church. No, we can't do that. We cannot bow down to the empire. We cannot, right? These so-called evangelicals have made themselves a part of the empire. This is not the time for us to be trying to debate them. We need to be trying to preach to those whose eyes can see and ears can hear, right? That the kingdom of heaven is not something that we're trying to wait to die to go to, but it's right here, right now. And we make it by how we begin to interact with each other, how we show love and concern for our brothers and sisters, how we refuse to bow down and to bend our back to the methods and the ideas of the empire, right? How we speak truth to power. All of those actions, how we make sure that justice is shared and that people who are in need are taken care of. All of those things begin to create the critical tension between us, the children of God, and the empire. It's ultimately it's going to lead to pain and suffering. There's no, unlike the people who are the so-called name it and claim it folk. When you live in your fullest faith,
Woo, don't
as,
it get hot?
as a
Don't it get
child of
hot?
the
No.
kingdom of God, it brings pressure on you.
Ooh, it does.
Right? It brings pressure on you. And it's not about just going around proclaiming how holy you are. It's about living in these very koinonia ways, living as what the evangelicals would call socialistic ways, right? Acting as if you care about people, creating a community that begins to build up, that walks around as if they are no longer oppressed, which then creates a contradiction in the society. So right now, I'm not interested in convincing evangelicals. They got their God, right? And time will tell, right? Time will tell with the God they got. So for me, that's it. Now, there are people. I've got a friend who does some wonderful stuff on this, Dr. Aubrey Hendricks, and he is probably one of the foremost theological liberation theology writers in the country right now. His latest book was called Christians Against Christianity.
Oh, I've seen that. Okay.
It's a brilliant book. And I mean, I've learned so much from Aubrey and what he has to say. He speaks to many of these things that you've raised up today, right? And it's actually a challenge to the so-called what is it? The whole title of that book, Christians Against Christianity: How Right-Wing Evangelicals Are Destroying Our Nation and Our Faith. He also wrote the book, The Politics of Jesus, right? Where he talks about and Aubrey is also a brother who came out of the movement. He's was a revolutionary nationalist. He still is, very much, he sees himself as a part of our movement. And he has written some brilliant books that help us to understand the revolutionary character and nature of our faith if we really understand who Jesus was at that time and who Jesus as the Messiah can be at this time.
That's some good stuff. I'm definitely going to grab both of those books, but I didn't want to ignore a couple of questions in the chat. Ross,
and if I don't quite answer a question, please pull me back in.
Okay. Right. This conversation is really good. We're already 14 minutes over time, so let me know if that's okay with you if we go a little longer. Okay, fantastic. Rockstone asks, to overcome this world, shouldn't we consider our religion practice to be superior to the existing religions? In other words, an evolution beyond the powers that be. That's an interesting question.
Could you ask that question again? I'm not sure I got it.
Sure. So they're asking, to overcome this world, shouldn't we consider our religion or practice to be superior to the existing religions? Now, I'm not sure what is meant by the existing religions, but in other words, an evolution beyond the powers that be.
I think when we're trying to be our authentic selves in relationship to God, when we are practicing the disciplines that draw us deeper into our faith in the best way we can, that's the call. I'm not sure I would be one to talk about. I don't compete with other people's religions in terms of superiority or not. I try to the best of my understanding of the scriptures, our people's traditions in relationship to God, right? So, because it's not just about mindless going along with scriptures, it's also the scriptures, our people's traditions, and my best understanding as well. All those things together, I think that's where when we talk about being guided by spiritual inspiration, that's where the Spirit moves in between those things. So trying to do to the best of our ability, right? Trying to follow our faith and our belief to the best of our ability is the call that we have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does to me, and I hope it answered the question. Here's another question that I think is a great one. 2Fs asks, "Is God also a community, or is God a single entity?"
I had a great friend that I went to seminary with years and years ago. It's been so long that he was a brother from Nigeria, and he wrote a book on the communitarian nature of God. That in terms of that, absolutely, God is community, and he made a great argument that I still use to this day. When we say that human beings are created in the image of God, we are most like God when we are most in community with other humans. That's how he,
Mm-hmm.
for instance, he argued that even the idea of the Trinitarian description of God is a very African understanding, that it's a community of deity, right? When we talk about the Trinity, right? That it's one in that God is one in community, right? So I don't have any problems in understanding that. I think when people do all these backflips and these, people trying to, they're trying to explain the Trinity, but then they say, oh, but it's really just one. And you know what? It's okay.
I love that answer.
you know,
It's
it's like, yes, I believe that God is one, and
Mhm.
that, God is one, and we are one in God, and we are most like God when we are trying to be one with our brothers and sisters of community.
Mm,
And
mm.
so he calls it a communitarian as opposed to, say, a Trinitarian understanding of God, right?
That's a lot more relatable, and it makes a lot more sense. Here's another great question. Do people have to convert others, or can people just spread the principles and love fellowship? And remember, I said at the top of the show, I don't where people's souls go after they have departed this mortal coil. That's beyond my pay grade. That's not a discussion I'm going to have with people. It's not an argument. I'm not going to argue whether people have a soul or not. I'm just not. My job is not to proselytize people to get people saved, because I can barely save myself from keeping myself into my household budget
Mm.
every 2 weeks. I surely can't help you save your soul. But I don't think
Mhm.
that's my job. I don't think that's what I'm called to do. But what is your answer to that question?
Absolutely. I think our work is to be a martyr, which is the word, or a witness, is to live our lives to the fullest, right? Giving praise to God. And praise to God is not, again, if, you know, we are limited by the language of English that we are trapped in, right? It's more than just sitting up in church, singing songs and shouting hallelujah. It's doing those things, being in community, right? Seeing a justice being needed and standing up for justice. Not just praying for people, but prayerfully engaging people in their needs, in being that witness, right? And not being afraid, for us as Christians, not being afraid to give the glory and the honor to God. Why am I involved in this revolution? Because God requires it of me, right?
Mhm.
You know,
Mhm.
that's the witness, right? And if that attracts people to want to become a part of the community, again, using a story from the scriptures in the book of Acts, which is the kind of the story of the early days of the church grew because people saw these people who would get together. Remember, under the thumb of the Roman Empire, under this oppression, when people are going hungry, people are landless, people don't have anything. And they saw this little group of people going around, and they weren't never hungry, because they would share. If one of them had something, they would sell it and then split the divides and stuff. And
Mhm.
people are seeing this and they saying, wow. And that's what drew them, because they saw people being a community at a time when the Roman Empire was encouraging people to atomize, to split up, to be
Mm.
individuals.
Mm.
When the Roman Empire was saying, we don't care if you're hungry, pay your taxes, right? you
Sound
know,
familiar?
they were seeing people who, even though the church in this case being the organized Jewish establishment, right? We're saying if you got eczema on your skin, you can't. First of all, you can't come around, and nobody can stand within 10 feet of you. You got to stand back. And matter of fact, you got to announce that you're unclean so people will know. So people are feeling ostracized and alienated from community. Women who might be sick. The story of the woman with the so-called issue of blood, who she was always hemorrhaging blood. She could never be in community with people. And people were seeing these people say, come on in. Let's pray for you. Right. And whether these people were medically cured or just spiritually healed, they were brought back into community, whatever you might want to call it. And people saw where people were able to be in relationship, not defined by who they were. You know, they saw that no matter what their condition, social, physical, medical, it didn't matter whether they were men or women, because the revolutionary Paul says in Christ there's neither male nor female.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
Right. It didn't matter if they were women, they had leadership positions. They, you know, they were leaders of groups in small churches. And they said, I want to be a part of that. It wasn't by people sitting out on a corner telling everybody they're gonna go to hell.
Mm.
You know, or people preaching people into hell. It was through actual work of creating a different life for people in the midst of oppression. And people wanted to become a part of that. It's the exact same thing that happened in the 60s and the 70s as the Black Panther Party and the US organization began to emerge and build up. People would see, wow, I want to be a part of that. Why did people want to join the Black Panther Party for self-defense? Because they saw first Huey and Bobby not afraid to talk to the police like, you know, like, I'm a man, I'm going to talk to you the way you talk to me, right? And they liked that. But then beyond that, when the party began to do things like having a free breakfast program, a freedom school for children, when they began to identify sickle cell as a problem in the Black community and began to work on that, thousands of young brothers and sisters now said, I don't want to gangbang no more. I'm going to join the party. Right? They were drawn to the party by the witness of the party. That's how we can live out our faith, by actually engaging the empire and dismantling the oppressive systems of the empire wherever we are. And we don't have to go like condemning people to hell, right? And again, as Christians, if we're doing it, we give honor. Hey, why are you doing this? I'm doing this because God requires this of me.
Right.
This is what God calls me to do. I believe that God is against oppression. God is against sexism. God is against homophobia. I believe that God don't want us to be hungry or homeless. And because of that, I'm taking this action. That's our witness. Not saying, well, oh, you believe that? You're going to hell. No, right? Each person can decide for themselves how they want to deal with God. But if we don't give a good picture of who God is, how can they even have a chance to even think about the God that we talk about?
This is a whole word right here. And it is something I think that, like I said, I needed, that several of my comrades, because I organized with a few of the people in the chat in real life. I tell people all the time, I do not just sit behind this camera however many times and try to act like I know all the things. God knows I do not. And I actually do the work as much as I can to whatever abilities he's allowed me to have. And he has surprised me with the things that he has allowed me to do, in the spaces he's put me in, and the people he's connected me to, like yourself. And of course, through Dr. Akinyela Emoja, who don't worry, I'm gonna get him back on the show, but he can't escape. But I want to ask you now, in the last few minutes, about your therapy profession. You are a licensed therapist.
I am.
And having having gone through, I don't know why my glasses can't ever stay clean, but anyway, having gone through a lot of, well, let me say it like this. As people who are living in an oppressed situation, we in the organization I belong to, the Black Alliance for Peace, we believe in the concept of domestic colonies, that working class and poor people, particularly African and indigenous people, we are forced into domestic colonies. That's what our neighborhoods and communities are.
Mm-hmm.
So we are living under that oppression, that colonization, which is a stressor all in its own in every aspect of our lives, which is an outside stressor, right? And then we have to deal with regular life that happens to everybody. Life happens to everybody. As horrible, and the past 2 years have been absolute hell for me. I have lost my whole little family. My husband died in June 21. Our dog died in May of 22. His adult son died in March of 22. His father has advancing COPD, so I'm hoping that he can, stick around for a while. My dad is 75 years old. I lost my health. I'm on dialysis. I'm waiting for a kidney transplant. All of this happened within two years since June of 2021. But that's life that happens to everybody. Yes, it usually does not happen to people the way that it happened to me. And I don't know what's so special about me that God was like, yeah, you can handle this. But it is what it is. But this is life that happens to everyone. We all lose people we love. We all face health challenges at some point, some more serious than others. We all have financial difficulty. We all have problems with people on our jobs, relationship. That's life. That happens to everybody. But Doctor, what happens when a people who are living in an oppressed situation are carrying the load of that oppression every day? And that oppressed situation is getting worse as the empire is faltering. It's crumbling under its own weight, however slowly. Not crumbling fast enough for me, but it's crumbling. And the repression gets worse. And then you've got people who are dealing with just life, and there's those other stressors, and then there are people within that community of people who believe they have a call in on their life, whether it is from God or whether it is just from them wanting to do something, that they believe they have to do something about the conditions that people live in, and that brings another level of stress. What does all of this do to the mental health, the emotional capacity of people in those situations? And how do we get out of the dilemma that those converging crises weigh down on us in different ways? But it's hard, it's impossible to look at the conditions we live in and not see that we are suffering under the weight of these things. You know what I mean? Does that question make sense? I know it was a huge question.
Well, yeah, I think yes, the things, and I'm really so sorry to hear about the loss of your husband and sounds like your father-in-law.
Yes, he's still
Yeah,
here, but his health
yeah,
is not good.
yeah, absolutely. No, yeah, those things happen, but you're right, and I would agree with your group in terms of that colonialism makes those things that much worse, and in fact oftentimes causes the conditions that created those situations, right? I am a therapist, and I believe and more Black people are utilize therapy and things like that, and that's good. Therapy is not liberation, though, right?
Mm,
Right?
mm.
Even though I think it's important, it's important to utilize that. Um, I'm working on a book that of some of my ideas on clinical work and questions of culture. I'm very much influenced by the ideas of Frantz Fanon as a therapist, and so in fact, I'm going to be doing a presentation of one of my book chapters on Fanon at a conference just next month. Fanon talks about, he says that the question of mental health, that all mental health issues are what he calls sociogenic. Right?
Yeah.
They grow out of social realities, not out because there's something in the brain or whatever. Of course, there are there's people have brain issues, and sometimes there are really there are mental health things that create skewed thinking, but all of that is made even worse by what our social situations, our social conditions. I believe that as in terms of mental health work, that an important part of our movement work needs to be creating mental health spaces grounded in building community. I believe that one of the ideas that Fanon uses that I think is really important for us to take up in mental health again these days is he talks about alienation. There's alienation from the self, right? This, we very rarely pay attention to ourselves because we're so distracted and caught. There's alienation from our own significant others, right? Where the tensions that come within families and the breakup in families, alienation from our community, alienation even from the larger society, alienation from nature. So there's all these levels of alienation, and the solution to alienation is community, bringing back to community. And so, for instance, I believe that it becomes important that we focus on ways to help people participate in, be parts of intentional communities, right? For some, whether it's, church communities, but not just doing church, but doing church intentionally, understanding how important it is for people to feel supported, to feel connected, right? Whether it might be, cultural communities, organizational communities that come together and pay attention to people's well-being. One of the things that I have ongoing trouble with, and I debate with my young comrades with this all the time, because I haven't found a way to explain it as of yet, is I'm really troubled by the idea of so-called self-care.
Ooh, no, that's a whole show.
Right.
Come on.
For me, it's grounded in neoliberal ideas of individualism, right? As opposed to, right, a community caring for each of its members, right? I believe that one of the mental health tasks, and I think that mental health is an important part of building of revolutionary organizing, is creating spaces of healing that are grounded in community. That's work, right? And it's easier said than done, right? Everything that you mentioned is this. You kind of talked about your own personal experience, but it's being broken from relationship. Your husband, your husband's son, your father-in-law, right? Your dog, right? It's like this feeling of being disconnected in relationship, alienated, right? But again, one of the things that we can learn from our ancestors, right? Is the reason that we, particularly when we are at our best, we call everybody brother, sister, such and such, sister so and so, auntie so and so, right? Is that one of the things that we learned when our people were being torn apart by being sold off into slavery and whatnot. Even if you can't find your real blood kin, there's always going to be a kin there for you. You just need to look for that auntie. She'll take care of you. Look for that uncle. He'll watch out for you. And we created what's called, and sociology, fictive kin, right? But we created these networks. We looked for community. I believe that we Africans, when we are at our best mental health, are in community. One of the sometimes when I do workshops, there's if you remember when the movie version of Beloved, right? And there's a scene in that which even though it didn't do well commercially, I thought it was a brilliant film, right? I see you, yes, it was. It was. It was and the reason it was is that one of the things in there's a scene where Sitha, she's going deeper and deeper into her madness. She's standing at the kitchen table, chopping ice, and talking to herself. And her daughter's trying to call out to her and reach her, and she can't hear. She has become, for months now, she hasn't talked to anybody. She hasn't done anything. People have just dropped off food at her door because they know, oh, that's that crazy woman. She's alienated, isolated, the absolute opposite of being an African woman.
Wow.
And at the height of that scene, the women who have been caring about her, what happened to Sitha? Where's she at? And they start getting together and talking, and then we're gonna go see about her.
Yep.
The community of women get together and they march down the road and get in front of Sitha's house, and they just begin praying and singing, which then draws Sitha's attention, and she comes out. And then Beloved, the demon, comes out and begins, and she looking crazier than anything else. And the women see, and they just begin praying and singing even more. And the demon disappears. And Sitha comes into her right mind. For me, that is symbolic of moving from madness, which for Africans is alienation and individuation, and being drawn back into community. It takes a community to heal us. And again, Frantz Fanon, that's what he focused on. His method of psychotherapy was to draw people back into familiar community, culturally familiar community, right? At first, he was trying to do it the way the French had trained him to do it. He would have Algerian brothers and sisters who were in the mental hospital watching movies, and it's like, and it didn't work. But then he started, okay, what is culturally familiar to them? Bringing their families in, having, creating coffee shops that they're used to sitting in, rather than movies, bringing in poets to recite traditional poetry, right? Treating them as if they are well, as opposed to treating them as if they are mad, right? And so creating community. I believe that that's going to be one of the important tasks of a revolutionary movement, is to build intentional communities, spaces where people can feel whole when they have had losses, right?
Wow.
So, yeah. Even though, and therapy is still important, but it's not liberation.
I mean, that needs to be on a T-shirt, a mug, flags, banners. It needs to be on murals. It needs to. We really, and self-care is also not liberation.
No, it is not revolutionary.
No, as much as I love a good getting away from everything to go to the beach and put my feet in the sand and commune with Yamaya, that's not liberatory. That's rest, and that's okay.
And I constantly get into arguments with my young comrades about that, but I'm going to find a way to explain my thinking on that one day, that hopefully that will make sense.
Listen, this has been more than I expected. I expected a lot because you were referred by Dr. Emoja. So I knew that you were worth talking to, just being associated with him. That's how much esteem I have from them. But this has been more than even my high expectations. And I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm going to. People in the chat are very excited about this conversation, and they want to hear more, and they want to have it on a regular basis. So would you consider being a monthly guest on Lukman Nation? We talk about anything you want, or however regularly you want to talk about these issues, because regardless of what people feel about God and Jesus and faith and spirituality, some type of grounding in community that doesn't have anything to do with dealing with the particular issues. We just need a community, and we need to have these conversations about, quite honestly, Dr. Akinyela, how we get there, because we don't know how to get to community. So that's my question to you. You don't have to answer right now, but I want everybody to know that I asked the question.
I will consider it.
Thank you for, and I'll let y'all know what we come up with, what his answer will be. How can people follow your work, connect with you, let people know how they can find out more about you and connect with you?
Yeah. They can look, my website is drmakungu.com. That's my clinical work there. I guess I'm Dr. Makungu is my handle for most of those other places. I think Zitter and Facebook and whatnot. I think Makungu Akinyela is Facebook. Yeah. Places like that. That's how they can reach me there. I'm not the best with social media.
And I'm going.
Can you hear me?
No worries. People will find you. Yes, I can. Can you hear me still?
I can.
Okay, yeah. People will find you. They're the folks in the chat, the comrades in the chat are great with that. And for some reason, I'm having a difficult time getting to the website, but I will find it and drop it in the chat for everybody. Thank you so much, Dr. Makungu Akinyela, for this conversation tonight, for your insight. Just fantastic conversation. Thank you so much, and I hope this won't be the last.
I appreciate it. I look forward to talking to you again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right, folks, that's that. It's a wrap. What else is there for me to say? And I hope that he will be able to join us, and some other people too, who are revolutionary, spiritually minded folks, will be able to join us on a somewhat regular basis. Look, like I said, I do not have all the answers. I can tell you a bunch of stories about how my faith developed and why my faith developed. But at the end of the day, I'm not really interested in proselytizing people. I don't care what you believe. I don't care if you don't believe. I don't care. It doesn't make any difference, because I believe that my mandate from my faith is that I am supposed to treat you and everyone around me according to the example of Jesus Christ. My concern is not supposed to be what you believe and what you don't believe and correcting your thinking. That's not what Christ tells us to do in the Bible. We are literally told to fight on behalf of the oppressed for justice. Fight for justice on behalf of the oppressed. The Bible tells us that God hates greedy people. The Bible tells us that God hates nations that oppress the poor. The Bible says that that God hates leaders that oppress the poor. And the Bible says that God hates the wicked every day. The Bible makes it clear who the wicked are. It's empires. It is imperialists. It is people who oppress and exploit the people over and over again. That is literally what's in the Bible. And some of that other stuff that is authoritarian and obedience focused and sexist and homophobic, that didn't come from God. That didn't come from Jesus. And I appreciate being able to bring Dr. Akinyela in to confirm what I had been saying all along. So thanks a lot, y'all, for joining me tonight. Appreciate you. As always, be really good to each other and be good to yourselves. A lot going on this weekend. Oh, yeah, October 1st is the launch event of the 4th annual Black Alliance for Peace Month of Action Against AFRICOM. Go to blackallianceforpeace.com to register for that webinar on Sunday to kick off the month of action against AFRICOM, and stay tuned for to the Black Alliance for Peace Twitter, Black Alliance for Peace DC Twitter, the Facebook pages, BAP Baltimore, for all of the events that we have coming up in the next month or so, because it's a lot. We busy a lot. But anyway, thank y'all so much for hanging out with me tonight. This has been a beautiful show, and I hope that you really, really loved it. I appreciate you as always. As I always say, a luta continua, the struggle continues. But if we continue to fight for what we know is right, Victoria acerta, victory is certain. Peace, y'all.